everyone, I'm Fola. Welcome to the first episode of the Diversifying Research Podcast. This is a podcast where we amplify the voices of underrepresented individuals who are either involved in research themselves or engage other underrepresented groups in research. Over the course of this limited podcast series, we'll critically consider how to improve the inclusion of underrepresented voices in research. For this episode, we're joined by Meerat Kaur, who works for the Applied Research Collaboration Northwest London. And over the course of this episode, Meerat is going to speak to us about her PhD, what her current role entails, and different steps of the research cycle and how these steps can be diversified. Hello Meerat, how are you?
All good, thanks, Fola.
Awesome. Could you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, so I'm Meerat Kaur. I am, as you said, part of an organisation called the Applied Research Collaboration for Northwest London. This is an organisation that was funded by the National Institute of Health Research, which is one of the big funders in the UK of health research. And essentially the Applied Research Collaboration is a partnership between Imperial College London, the university, and the NHS partners across Northwest London. And essentially it was originally set up to speed up the time it takes to get research into practice and to improve care through research.
Great, that sounds really, really important and impactful. I'm aware that you also completed your PhD on healthcare systems. Could you speak to us about why you decided to research that topic and what your main findings were?
Yeah, so I researched how you work together to improve healthcare systems, and specifically how healthcare professionals and patients and the public work together to improve healthcare. And the reason I did this was because this was an area that I've worked in and do work in now. And it's something that I'd been working in for quite a while. And we had learned a lot from our practice about what works and what doesn't. But we'd also knew that every few years we get a whole host of new researchers or new healthcare professionals who we start working with and start engaging with, for whom this is all incredibly new. And they don't know what they're doing or how to do it. And the same questions kept coming up and again and again. So I wanted then to advance the research about this to understand actually how do we really embed this in practice? How do we get it to work in practice? How do we get healthcare professionals and patients to work together more effectively to improve healthcare systems? And what can we learn from different organisations who do this in different ways?
And do you feel like you've been able to implement those findings in your current job role?
Yes, I think we have. So the build-up of the current organisation has really taken on board a lot of the theories that I looked at in my PhD, which highlight how you have organisations which can effectively create partnerships between different people from either within the organisation, but also really include those from outside of the organisation. So there's theories which highlight actually, dialogue and regular reflexivity between people is really important. And so while that sounds incredibly simple, that just doesn't happen all the time, and it doesn't happen within all health and care spheres. So that type of evidence of how it's happened in practice, but also the theories behind why people work together effectively is definitely what I bring into my day job.
So within your role, you have a lot of expertise, and I thought it would be great to have you on the first episode because you have a really in-depth understanding of research and the specifics of it. So to start off with, I thought it would be useful for our listeners to have an explanation of the different stages of the research cycle and how it can be diversified. So before we get into the different stages of the research cycle, could you give us a definition of what the research cycle is?
So the research cycle is one of the ways that people identify the areas of research and essentially conduct the research, design how they're going to do it, carry it out. The idea is that there's various processes which form a cycle, and that's how you carry out research. So that's what the research cycle is really about.
Thanks for that definition. So the first stage is thinking of an idea or a concept. What is that all about?
So the idea is that research questions shouldn't just come from our heads. They shouldn't just be things that we want to do for the sake of it, especially when we're looking at health and care. And so they should actually come from a need and something that ideally would make things better if we tackled it. If we could really understand, it could make things better. Or it's something that we really need to work on to understand things a bit better because we're not quite sure what's going on in a particular area.
Okay, thank you. And following the idea and concept stage, of course, you then need to plan and design the research. What does that involve?
So that involves just shaping how you're going to conduct the research, and that varies depending on what your research question actually is, and also who's identified the priority. So this all links together. It shows how the research cycle all kind of links together, and the parts flow into the next part. It's not like one's an individual part. So, for example, we know that communities are really good at identifying areas of research that matter to them. There's amazing work going on, for example, an organisation called Black Thrive, which has looked at mental health issues, and that's come from their communities that they worked with, who've highlighted this as a particular area of need. And then the design has been appropriate to that because they're looking at how do you understand mental health issues for particularly Black communities. And so they've worked with community researchers to really ensure that that works well. So the design has been really focused on the needs that have been identified and also the potential focus as well.
That's a really great example. And then after the planning and design stage, of course, you then need funding or you need to get it commissioned. Can you speak about that stage?
Yeah, so there are loads of places that actually fund research. Obviously, the National Institute of Health Research is one of those. But there's lots of community organisations as well, which might provide small funds for it, or there's other national funding organisations. But what a lot of these tend to want to see is that there's a real need to do the research. Again, it's not just something you want to do because you think it sounds great or it'll advance your career. They need to see a real strong case for why you want to do it and why now as well. A lot of that at the moment comes from how you've worked with people, whether it's patients or the public or communities, and how what they've been telling you can be shaped into why you're doing this in the way you've decided to do it and why you're doing it now.
Nice. And so after it's been funded or commissioned, it then needs to be implemented. So what does that look like?
We have to then start really understanding how we're going to do the research and how, through conducting the research, what's going on, what's going wrong, what's going right, and are we really ensuring we collect the right levels of data to answer the research question? Are we hearing from the right people? And if we're not, what can we do to ensure that we continue to work and target the right people? So some of the research that's come out about this, for example, have highlighted that it's really important for researchers and the research process to really understand and be culturally appropriate. And that's not just culturally appropriate for people of different ethnicities, that's culturally appropriate for all sorts of different walks of life as well. Researchers start to speak, research speak, like anyone, I guess. You know, you get so caught up in the phrases you tend to use that you may not be articulating things very clearly. And so it's really important for everybody, either within the research sphere or outside of it, to really understand what's going on, and for the research process to ensure that it is designed, is conducted to take into account different needs. For example, we've previously recruited community champion type roles where people will facilitate focus groups with different people, different communities, and they might speak different languages. And we've also worked with people who help us shape things not just within different languages, but also in different formats. So, for example, we worked with people with learning disabilities and we shaped everything in easy read. So there's various ways of carrying out the research, and this all needs to be considered as part of that. So are your surveys, for example, are there easy read versions of your surveys and things like that?
Those are really great suggestions. Do you have any advice for researchers who might want to carry out research but do not have a good understanding of different cultures? So, for example, are there any groups that researchers can reach out to in order to ensure that their research is culturally appropriate?
I think there's a lot of community groups, actually, who we can learn from. They're really good at understanding how to work with different communities. They've obviously done it. They've got the expertise and they've often got the relationships. And so I think it really is about focusing in. During the cycle, you'll at one point start to understand which are the population groups you want to work with. Who do you want to work with? Whether that's specific communities or whether that's people with specific needs. And that will help you understand which organisations you could reach out to.
Okay. And in terms of reaching out to these organisations, what do you think is the best practice?
It's great if you reach out to them very early on in the research cycle before you're identifying and prioritising. The reason is because obviously these community organisations, when they help us, that's not cost neutral for them. It entails costs, it takes resources, and it'd be really great if we set up more formal partnerships with such organisations, if they're quite crucial to your work. Setting up partnerships before you apply for funding means you could potentially give them funding through the proposal. You could, cost in their time. However, if you haven't done that, organisations have said that they are happy to have free conversations. The issue is you have to understand that you can't continue to have free conversations. So they can help you to some level, and then it would potentially be about you finding other funds to see actually how can you work together with them.
Those are really great suggestions. So after the implementation stage, it's then time to analyse the data. How is that currently being done, and do you think it can be done in more inclusive ways?
To be quite honest, Fola, it happens in various ways and it depends on your approach and how you're doing this. So with the Community Voices work that I'm part of, Community Voices is a collective across North West London. There's lots of different organisations who are part of that, as well as individuals. And we've collected stories from people and had conversations with people about COVID, basically. And to really hear from communities, specifically BAME communities, who may be at the forefront of COVID, because we really want to ensure that we embed an approach where everybody who's part of that collective has ownership over everything. We analyse as a collective and then we continue to share findings very rapidly with the group, and then they get a sense check of actually, is that really what they think they're hearing as well, or is there something else that we're not hearing that they think is really important that they're hearing? So this really helps with the analysis. It helps us understand that actually what we're hearing is definitely right, or do we need to collect more data? However, there's also times when data is analysed by a group of researchers who sit in an office who only see the data but don't necessarily put it into a context. They have more limited understanding, I'd say, of what they may be looking at. And so I'd say that in terms of the analysis, there's a potential at every level to really share that with people and with the communities, especially when we're working with diverse communities, to share that with them, to say, actually, this is what the data's saying. Is that true of your experience as well?
Definitely. And the work you seem to be doing with Community Voices seems like it's taken on a very great and inclusive approach. You spoke about everyone within the group having ownership over the work. Why do you think that is important?
So it's important to enable other people to shape what happens. So basically the collective is formed on the idea that everybody who's part of it should equally be there. Not any one of us has better experience or understanding or skill than anyone else. And that is really important because it's a collective. You know, the reason we've reached into communities which statutory organisations often think of as hard to reach, the collective has the relationships that have been established over long periods of time through people such as the community organisations who are part of the collective. But we really need this reciprocal relationship. The community organisations can't just feel like they're giving us all these relationships and getting nothing in return. And so it needs to be a really open process so they can feel like they can influence it. And actually, if things really matter to them, or if they need some help with things, that we can shape that with them as well. So the open structure helps really embody that. It builds in transparency, it helps people shape things and influence things, and it creates a more egalitarian structure.
That's really fantastic, because from the outside looking in, I feel like research can be very hierarchical. So it's great that you're doing this work that's going against the grain and just promoting equality. And so after analysing the data, the next stage is then ensuring that research is disseminated. What is dissemination?
So dissemination is where we share the research findings, and it's really crucial. It's not something that should be an afterthought. And the reason it's so crucial is because a lot of the research we do, for example, it's funded by taxpayers. And even if it wasn't, to be quite honest, we just have a right as citizens to understand the research that's carried out, often about conditions that we might have or services we might use or things that we might want to do. And we should be able to see the results of that in order to inform our own practice. You know, I should be able to understand, I have eczema, I should be able to understand the most recent evidence about treatment of eczema and how I can manage it better. That should be just how it is. And similarly, me knowing that then helps feed into prioritising future research as well. So dissemination is incredibly important, and we've seen some real powerful examples of people from diverse communities being involved in dissemination. So a little while ago, we used to use things such as soapboxes, where you'd kind of create in a community room, you'd have a gathering, and there'd be people on soapboxes basically disseminating their research. And these would be people who were from different communities, so they disseminate it in very different ways. It could be through spoken word, or it could be through various poems or things in various languages. But the idea is the results and the process start to be shared with people in ways that matter to them and in ways that mean something to them.
That sounds like a really engaging way of communicating research findings. And in terms of dissemination, do you think the correct system whereby citation is seen as a key indicator of successful research discourages dissemination among wider communities?
I think it can structure dissemination. I think publishing in journals is important, and there's no getting away from that. The fact is that a journal that's published today, a journal article that's published today, my daughter will still be able to access after I've gone. So that's the idea. You know, certain things live on longer and the knowledge is there. But the thing is that it does structure how we see things. So sometimes people only focus on writing that journal article. And also writing a journal article is the one first step almost, but actually not all journal articles will be what we call open access. They won't be accessible to everybody without a fee. So obviously restricts who can access it. And similarly, yes, you're right. Our existing academic infrastructure does really encourage people to write journals, and potentially at the expense of other forms of dissemination, which aren't necessarily valued in the same way and in the same light as those journal articles.
Interesting. And you mentioned open access publications. So what are those?
Open access publications are papers or journals that people can access without paying a fee. So the publishing industry is a business, and essentially what happens is that sometimes in order to submit a paper to a journal, you'll need to pay a fee in order for it to be open access as researchers. And if you can't pay the fee, it won't be open access, and people, the readers, will have to pay a fee to read it. And this is obviously really restrictive for people who aren't within academic institutions and don't have access to these papers. And it's specifically restrictive for us as people who might have longer-term conditions, or who want to find out the most recent information about particular conditions. So publishing isn't the greatest thing at the moment, and we really do need to kind of strive towards having more open access.
Yeah. And I guess there might be some listeners that are interested in research and weren't aware that there is something such as open access publications. Are there any open access publications you can recommend that our listeners can search up?
Potentially, if you do want to see one that isn't open access, you can possibly contact the author. That sometimes helps you get access to the paper. There isn't necessarily full journals as such, which are often open access. The exceptions to that are things such as a journal called Research Engagement and Involvement, and there's a few other ones like that.
Awesome. Thank you. And after dissemination, the final stage of the process is to evaluate the research and make recommendations. Could you talk us through this stage of the cycle?
There's two elements to it. One is to make recommendations, but the other one is also potentially to implement things as well. It depends on, again, what your research aimed to do in the first place. Did it aim to deepen inquiry into a topic? Did it aim to, learn a lot more? Or did it aim to actually try and improve things? So depending on which one you've taken depends on whether you go towards implementing findings or simply recommending findings. So obviously, as with anything, throughout this whole cycle, patients, the public or communities should be involved in shaping recommendations, because they should have been involved throughout the whole process, and they should by now have a solid understanding of actually what are the key recommendations that would impact things the most, would make the biggest difference. And that's often for policy, but it could also be for local services. And that's where the implementation side crosses over as well. It could be, for example, in our own work where we look at various improvements in healthcare, and people through this type of research can highlight actually the specific thing needs to be changed. The patients might have raised specific areas, and therefore they could potentially focus down on what needs to be implemented to improve the situation.
Thank you. We're coming towards the end of this podcast episode. Is there anything you would like to plug or mention that we haven't covered?
I think it's just that there are amazing community organisations out there, and there is amazing people, members of the public, patients from all different walks of life who are already involved in health research. There are groups who we need to work to engage a lot more. And so if we really just focus on shaping appropriate research in the right ways, and we can work with these people and with these communities to do that, then we're more likely to have results and adequate research, which kind of highlights actually what really matters to people and gives us decent findings.
Thank you so much for joining me, Meerat. You explained the research cycle really well and suggested really practical ways it can be diversified. And I'm sure that our listeners found it very useful. I think my main thing I've taken away is that the cycle is very fluid. So thank you for teaching me that, amongst other things. Please make sure you tune into our next podcast episode, where I'll be speaking to another guest about how to further diversify research. Thank you.